Hello, and welcome to the Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth, and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larsson.
James, thanks very much for joining me today on the podcast. We're just having a great conversation off mic about football, and it reminded me that football is such an amazing way, sport generally, for people to come together to share an experience. And I think some of that is really going to play into what we're talking about today with regards to planning more broadly, but also alternative living and kind of co-living collaborative models more broadly. So before we dive into it, James, why don't you give us an introduction to yourself?
Thanks, Tom. Firstly, thanks for having me on the podcast. Listened to lots of the previous editions, and it's really great to be here today. So thank you. So I'm James Armitage-Hobbs. I'm a director at DP9. For those that don't know DP9, we're a planning consultancy focusing on planning in central London. I've worked here for it's just coming up to 10 years actually. Worked in previous consultancies before that, but always been in central London. So that's a bit of background to me.
Yeah, interesting. And so, over that 10-year period, when we talk about co-living and alternative living today, it does really feel like about a 10-year period that kind of sector has emerged. But actually, the origins of this go way back. We've been living together as people, ever since we've been around as a species, really. And then obviously models of cohabitation, cooperatives, etc. In the early 20th century were obviously really popular as well. So how do you see the co-living now, maybe over that 10-year period, and where we are today?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. And as you said, it started around 10 years ago. And I remember when first day at DP9, co-living landed on my desk, and first question was, what on earth is this? Never heard of it. And it obviously didn't fit into any planning policies or guidance at the time. And I think it was really interesting because client came to us and said, look, I've got this great idea. I think kind of graduating from university, you move to London and other big cities, and your first option is to look on spareroom.com, where am I going to live? And you end up typically in a Victorian terrace, sharing a house with 3 or 4 people that you don't know, in a pretty average accommodation. You're sharing your private spaces, kitchen and bathrooms, which isn't ideal. And equally, you've got a landlord that's probably faceless. You don't know who they are, difficult to get hold of, and it's not a great place to be. And I think the other point on that is a loneliness issue as well, which I think we'll come on to later in the podcast. But I think the idea was, how do we give people a better place to live, closer to where they work, and in a kind of professionally managed environment where you have your own space, but you live within the building, and it gives you an opportunity to meet like-minded people. And you kind of have that option to, yes, I can have, an evening to myself in my room, or I can go and mix and meet people, maybe cook a meal or watch a film. So that was kind of the challenge that was posed to us right at the start of the process. And we've kind of seen that grow and evolve over the last 10 years. And we are where we are today with, I think, what is quite an established use now. I think you'll still say it's emerging, but it's out there. We've got schemes that are built, they're operational, and people kind of get it now, whereas it didn't when we started. So it's been a real journey, but I think it's been successful so far.
Yeah, no, definitely. And what you've just described there, that value proposition or that sort of pain point that it's solving, all sounds very logical today. But there's been a big journey, hasn't there, over the past few years to do that. And it's great to kind of unpack some of that with you, not just in terms of the kind of the product and the customer type and maybe the design, but also the kind of the regulatory and the context within which that this happens. Because it's fair to say that with any kind of innovation, with any disruption or new model that doesn't necessarily fit in category A or attached to category B, that often takes a little while to come through. And also, there's the devil's in the detail with these things as well, isn't it? Whether it's process or whether it's kind of the quality of the product and the environments that people are living in. So the kind of the why, I think, is quite clear, particularly for certain demographics, but how to go about doing that has definitely evolved.
Yeah, sure. And it's quite interesting because, as I said, when we started off, it was just an idea. We were going to see planners, politicians, other stakeholders with essentially pictures on pages and trying to kind of present and sell the idea to them. But it was only really when we started to get some live case studies, schemes starting to be built and operational, that it's been easy to sell the idea to people and actually show how it works. Because like with anything new, people are skeptical. And when you're talking to planners and politicians, it's the first thing. It's like, oh, this is a bit different, but this is a bit hard for us. It's not, this isn't proper housing. So, how does it actually work? And I think that's when we started to get the traction. And I think with everything, people don't always get it right first time. So the kind of initial schemes that were built out, they had their shortcomings, but I think that was useful because you could then say, look, this is working really well. It's popular. This is how it's run and managed, but there are some kind of shortcomings and lessons learned, I think.
Yeah.
So we can look at those, and that's how the kind of generation 2, should we call it, co-living schemes have evolved.
Yeah.
And I think that's also helped to influence planning policy and guidance as well, because I think initially, particularly GLA guidance that's come out has been, the first pass of that was very kind of granular in terms of the detail, and it wasn't until we kind of brought together a cohort of developers and architects and planners and put together a joint representation on that. The planners actually thought, we need to listen to these guys because they know how to do it. So I think it's really just a kind of a lessons learned and looking at case studies and how the use has evolved over the years has been really quite important.
Yeah. So that evolution to now. So how do you see the use class kind of fitting in, like, from a kind of strategic planning perspective, locations that are best suitable, demographics that it most suits, the space within the market that it's kind of catering for?
I think, in terms of location, typically central London, accessible locations are probably the main driver, because and the usual demographic or typical demographic is younger people. Like I said, people who, singles who are looking for somewhere to rent that's convenient, close to work, and I think this whole the certainty over your monthly bills as well, which is really, really important. But I think every site's different, and every scheme's different. And I think if you did some work on looking at the demographic in each building, it will be different depending on where you are. And I think talking to some of our clients, it's not just younger people. They're seeing retirees moving in because it's a point in their life, I think. And older people who maybe are lonely, living on their own, or they've been divorced and they want to be part of a community again. So I think it does vary, but I think if you look at it, typically it will be a younger kind of a younger demographic in these buildings.
Yeah. That makes sense. And so, what are some of those barriers that you kind of come up against then, whether it's perception or actually kind of real barriers, like or concerns that people would have when you're trying to sort of unlock these development sites?
Yeah, so as I said, I think every site's different, but when you are talking to the planners and the politicians early in the process, I think design quality is a big point. I think on the face of it, they look at small rooms and think, well, is that an acceptable living environment for people? So it's getting over that idea of you don't just live within the room, you live within the building. You have your private space, which is adequate. You've got your sleeping space, you have your small kitchenette, you've got your ensuite. But the idea is you generally only really use that space for sleeping. You go and use the gym, you might want to cook a meal with some friends in the shared kitchens, and you live within that building. And then equally, it's getting across the point that these are professionally managed as well, by people who know what they're doing. So it's really just getting across that quality point, and it's not just, as some people say, it's just kind of student accommodation for graduates essentially. So there's going to be all the associated impacts on people's amenities. So I think that's one of the key things. and also just how it's going to help in terms of housing delivery as well. So it's obviously a use that's recognised in the London plan that contributes to housing numbers. So that's important. It's getting that message across.
Can you just go into that for a bit more detail, actually, for my benefit and for others as well, just where the use class thing has sort of settled down now? Because for a long time it was flexible, wasn't it? Some people were looking at kind of a sui generis land use, some people were looking at hotel and varieties in between. But could you talk about how it's kind of landed in that?
Yeah, the shared living, co-living use is sui generis, and that, in kind of boring planning speak, is because it's a non-self-contained residential use, and that's on the basis that you don't have everything in your private room that you would need for your kind of typical living requirements. So, for example, you don't have a washing machine, you've got to leave your room to go and do your washing. So that means the whole building becomes a planning use, and that's why it's classified as sui generis. And that's now recognised in the London plan, and that's the approach that's taken across, traditional co-living or shared living developments.
Yeah. And I know one of the concerns for local authorities was around the broader kind of public benefit story that was kind of coming from some of these developments. So how do you and your clients and partners articulate that public benefits story now, both what goes on within the building and also what it contributes externally to the neighbourhood?
Yeah, so again, it kind of depends on what the overall scheme is, but I guess the key benefits is the delivery of housing, contributes to the borough's housing targets. And I think in the current day, where there's very few traditional C3 schemes coming forward because of all the issues around build costs and everything else, I think that's something that's really important. I think the affordable housing can play a key part. I mean, I could probably speak for an hour about how affordable housing is delivered, but what we're seeing is there's different ways of doing it. I guess the general approach is a payment, which doesn't always land well with boroughs, because they're saying, well, what can we do with the cash? So what we've seen in more recent years is, on larger sites, there is the possibility of delivering traditional affordable housing alongside the co-living. And that lands very well, particularly because there's a lot of stalled sites in London at the moment where you've got a C3 scheme with 35% affordable housing, but build costs have gone up and all the rest of it are no longer viable. So we've had quite a few clients come to us and say, well, we can still deliver the scheme, but the market portion will need to be co-living, and we'll still give the borough the affordable housing that they would have got. And that's landed well, and it's really a key part of kind of unlocking these sites and kind of maintaining that delivery of homes. So that's important. And then the other way of delivering affordable housing is more of a kind of a discounted market rent. Now that's not recognised in policy, but we did some schemes a few years ago in Wandsworth where the council, they didn't want the money, but they said, well, if you can deliver kind of discounted rents on a portion of the co-living, that would meet our housing requirements and people on our housing list. So that landed really well. But unfortunately, we're kind of hamstrung by the London plan now, which says it's got to be a payment, or you can do your C3 affordable. So that option's a bit more difficult to navigate through the system. But we've always thought that could be a really key benefit, especially when you're looking at key workers, because it meets their kind of their salary threshold. So we don't want to ignore that. We do keep reminding the planners about that approach. So hopefully you can get some traction again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think as an industry, frankly, as a kind of society, we do need to be much more innovative around ways that we can tackle the cost of living crisis and affordability issues. And supply is obviously a key part of that. As you mentioned, we need to be able to deliver the planning permissions that are in place. And as I say, economic shifts have meant that that's not really viable in a lot of cases without, as you say, adjusting to the Building Safety Act and also the broader development viability issues. So yeah, as part of a mix, I think it makes a lot of sense to include that. And so how do you see that kind of affordability piece more broadly in terms of how we continue to create spaces or products more broadly that are affordable? Because the kind of the underlying commercial rationale to co-living is you effectively you get more units in. They're a smaller size. Obviously, an overall rentable value for the building is therefore greater than if you had 1, 2, and 3 bed units, and that offsets the loss of net space that you get from the communal spaces that kind of factor that in. So on a comparable per square foot basis, it's more commercially attractive than, say, a C3 use, even when you factor in the affordable. Although I think from ones we've looked at, when you factor in the affordable in certain boroughs, that margin is of it improving on C3 is dramatically reduced. But yeah, so how do you see, maybe, because there's lots of other challenges, aren't there? There's family housing, there's later living, there's student, there's all sorts of different categories within the living sector or the alternative living sector. So maybe what lessons do you think maybe come out of co-living that you could maybe apply to some of those other uses, particularly around tackling kind of delivery, supply, and affordability?
I think it probably stands on its own. I'm not sure how much real comparison you can make with things like elderly care and maybe student. There is some comparisons, but yeah, I think in terms of kind of meeting a housing need, delivering on affordable housing, and I think the other spin-off benefits of schemes as well, which is really important, is we always try and look at them as mixed use developments. It's not just about the co-living. It's what are you doing at ground level, and a lot of the schemes will do it like a co-working offer or a community offer as kind of a real draw to the scheme. So it's not just about, oh, this is just a co-living scheme, it's going to be just for residents. It's what can we do to kind of integrate it with the community. And I know we've done schemes in the past where there's been a music venue at ground floor or a community space, and it really helps sell it, particularly when you're going out speaking to local residents and the community. It's saying, look, we can offer this. We want you to come into the building, and it's all about community, not just within the building, but as a bigger picture piece.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that's really quite important.
Yeah, no, fully agree. And although in our industry we like to put buildings or sort of business models into sectors, whether it's living or work or leisure, the reality is, neighborhoods and the way we live these days is so much more blended than that. And actually, the leisure, the community, the work offer that comes with these living offers is fundamental, really, to underpin the value of the building and that offer to customers. And I think actually, if it's done right, we had on a previous episode of the podcast, we talked to Tom and James from Noiscape, who are in the co-living space, but in the much smaller kind of boutique space at the moment. And that whole conversation evolved around, well, how can we provide the amenity that we want for the residents within the building, but we also want to be open and we want to provide facilities for the neighbourhood and for the community more broadly to come in and use. And I think successful buildings and projects have to do both. You look back at the kind of classic office buildings of the 80s and 90s, which were basically quite closed and or very closed and secure and basically sticking two fingers up to the neighbourhood in a lot of respects.
Yeah.
Nowadays, the trend, even within workspaces, is to try and be more open and try and engage more with the neighbourhood. So I think, broadly speaking, that's a much more interesting trend, and not only for the buildings but also for the local communities. And so I think it's great that some of these offers, I know, as you say, some of the operators are really quite forward thinking about this, about how you can kind of co-design and co-create some of these spaces. And I think that's only enriching to the value, really, of the place and the product. So that's great to hear. What would you say about, as one kind of counter that we have at Grow Places to overly amenitized buildings, whether it's offices or living or anything, is this: they can have the opposite effect sometimes of kind of sucking the life out of the neighborhood or out of the high street, and kind of bringing that all into the building. And although that can maybe have some commercial benefits for the building owner, it can be detrimental to the neighborhood more broadly. So how do you find that sort of balance within the products, that it's not always about the sort of shiny penny syndrome of kind of how many amenities can you cram into the development.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and it's something that we always, when we're looking at or when we're advising the client on how much amenity space is required and what those amenity spaces look like, it's quite easy to just look at the guidance and it says, you've got to do 4 square meters of this and 1 square meter of external space per resident. But I think it's very much a site by site approach, and you need to look at what's going on in the surrounding area to kind of guide what you're going to deliver. So it's kind of common sense. If there's a gym on the doorstep, do you really need to put a gym in this scheme? Because a lot of the developments we're looking at, and particularly a couple of schemes we're doing in the city at the moment, they're in areas where there's not a huge amount of amenity existing, or it's failing, and that's why there's been a real drive about activating the ground floor and trying to provide an amenity for people to bring them to the area. And when you look at somewhere like the city, it's busy Monday to Thursday, Friday to Sunday it's dead. And the city have got this initiative about Destination City. How can we enliven the place, bring people there, encourage people to live and work in areas quite close to there, where they actually work. So I think it's a really good point, and I think what we try and get across to the planners when we're talking to them is, don't use this guidance too strictly. I think it's got to be flexible, and it's got to be used in a way that it's gonna help the place. I think that's the key thing.
Yeah, definitely. And so you touched on kind of loneliness and some of those kind of really basic human needs that I talked about. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is often referred to a lot in the co-living space, and those kind of foundational needs, as well as some more kind of aspirational aspects about what we want to do as humans, and purpose and meaning. So how do you see that kind of broader sensibility around value, human value, human connection, and what that actually means in terms of the product and the sale to local authorities, and the overall kind of value proposition that co-living and other alternative living models kind of produce?
I think I think it's got to be focused on kind of the objectives for the local authority, and it's really creating a site-specific case that's going to address that local authority's requirement. So, housing needs the obvious one, but I also think that you can look at not just kind of direct benefits, but it's more indirect benefits as well. And so, just referring to the couple of projects I've done in the city recently, it's not just about delivering new homes. It's been about kind of helping business in the city. So I think it's those indirect economic benefits of allowing, probably in the city's case, younger people, graduates, to be able to live close to some of the big corporate businesses in the city. Whereas at the moment, they're obviously priced out. To rent a 1-bed flat in the city, be extremely expensive. So the opportunity to allow people to rent a room for 10, 12 months and probably also benefit things like interns as well. And a lot, the city have been really quite strong on that point. And I think all the big businesses will be, really welcoming of people being able to live close to where they are. And it's a good source of jobs as well. So I think that's another thing that needs to be really, really driven across. But that won't work for every borough. There'll be other benefits that we'll need to draw down on.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it works, probably in my view, I think it works best as a super urban core product for all those reasons you've just mentioned. And also because, just the economics of it, the land values, the property values are such that typically the closer to the centre you are, the more valuable that is. So if you're going to provide spaces that are affordable for people to live, then it's got to be under similar types of models where frankly, the commercials of that model are stronger than traditional residential, so that people can afford to occupy it, but also the developer and the investor can afford to be competitive on a kind of a change of use basis from, say, an office to housing, or just purely on a development viability, cost versus value of building or refurbishing and change of use of these products. So yeah, I think it's got a really, really important place to play, particularly in those kind of core urban areas. And more broadly, that has a lot of downstream benefits to urban neighborhoods more broadly. The city, as you mentioned, trying to still be a business first place, but be a much more of a mixed use place as well, that's got people living there, that's culturally relevant, and that helps support the local businesses, the high street, the footfall 7 days a week, as opposed to a kind of peak sort of Tuesday to Thursday sort of commuter workflow.
Yeah, and I think the point around change of use is really important as well, because obviously post-COVID, there's so many dated buildings now that aren't viable for continued office use, and what co-living, it's a very agile use. You can do new build or you can do conversion schemes, and a couple of schemes we've done recently is dated office stock, but it's not viable to people don't want to work in these buildings because they're poor quality. They don't have all the amenities that people are looking for now. And we've done 2 really successful schemes where it's essentially a change of use. The layout of the existing offices just lends itself well to the kind of repetitive pattern of the co-living layouts. And it's been really successful because not only is it retaining the existing building, it's helping with the whole carbon agenda at the moment in London, and obviously the city, that's really high up on their agenda. So they've been really successful, and I think that's a really good way of delivering homes as well. This reuse of dated office stock, which are generally in really good locations as well.
Yeah.
Really accessible locations and close to other core business areas where people work.
Yeah. No, James, it's great to have that really deep dive into that specific use, which, as I say, I think is really, really exciting. Has a really important part to play in urban living, particularly going forwards. And it's not the whole solution, like none of these things are, but it's definitely part of a more dynamic housing mix and lifestyle mix, I think is great. But maybe like zooming out a little bit from that then, for you personally, you say you've kind of maybe coincidentally kind of ended up in co-living sort of 10 years ago, but you've obviously enjoyed it enough to sort of dedicate your kind of most of your work time to those kind of types of projects. And for you personally, why do you feel like this work is meaningful for you, and why do you enjoy doing what you do?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and the market's always changing, so there's different sectors to work in. But obviously, this is quite a key one at the moment, and it's something feels like I've been on a journey, which has been really, really challenging, but also exciting at times as well. And it's what's really great is now seeing schemes being delivered, because there's nothing better as a planner. You're there from the very start when someone comes to you with an idea, and you're giving them initial advice on development potential, all the way through to now seeing people living in these buildings is really, really important. And it's really, really quite satisfying. But I think it just goes back to probably the points I was making at the start, where I remember I moved to London and I didn't, I had to go and try and find somewhere to live, and you're looking on Gumtree and spareroom.com, and you end up in a house with a bunch of random people, and it's not great. It's not a great start. And I think this really, I'm probably too old for it now, but I've got family,
me too.
kids and stuff. But if I'd been moving to London at now, I think it's really, really obvious place to go and live. So I really see that as a real benefit, and creating community and solving things around loneliness. I think it's really, really important. So that's kind of my personal feeling towards the use.
Yeah. And more broadly to what you do, the role of being a planning consultant, working in cities, seeing things happen, where do you have a feel for where that kind of comes from in you, or like your background, or why you've ended up doing what you're doing?
Yeah, I think a lot of people ask that, because I remember when I was at university, because I did a planning degree, and people were thinking, why on earth have you chosen to do that? Well, why aren't you doing something a bit more kind of run of the mill. And I said, well, I think there were two things. I quite liked geography and I liked architecture, but I didn't want to be an architect. So it was kind of looking at those interests and kind of attributes, and just thinking, well, also looking beyond being at university, what am I going to do when I finish? And kind of looking at jobs, and I saw this sector and thought, that kind of brings everything together that I like doing and interests, and the opportunity to then work in central London on, the biggest prestigious projects has been, a real drive. And, it's an ever challenging sector to work in. But, I think it's really important. And I think building relationships is a real key part of the success of the job, whether that's with colleagues, clients, planners, politicians, stakeholders, and being able to communicate effectively as well is really important, whether that's writing a report, an email, sitting in a meeting with people to negotiate and sell an idea is something I really enjoy doing. So,
yeah. No, great. And I think everything you've just described there is the core of it, really, isn't it? It's I think a lot of people who work in our industry enjoy the people side, the humanities side more broadly, and that's definitely the case for me as well. So it does boil down, as you say, to those relationships, to building that consensus and negotiation a lot of times to try and explain kind of or agree on some of that common ground that is about kind of policy and what do places need in what could be kind of like a static sense in terms of the policy that was drawn up in this year versus some of those big trends about where things are going and the shifts, both positive shifts around bringing people together, how people want to live, but also some of those slightly more difficult topics around affordability. How do we tackle cost of living and some of those things? And I think as a part of a solution to that, I think it's been a really interesting discussion to dive into that. So yeah, thanks very much for your time today, James. And look forward to continuing to work together and watching more and more of these schemes come through and be built out.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, thanks for having me.
No worries.
Great.
Thanks, James.
Thank you for listening to the Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com. And follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.